Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you today. Before we begin, I want to dedicate this to my grandfather who passed last night, who was a staunch, very straightforward Christian in the most toxic way possible. So I dedicate this to the composting of that belief system that he was inside of and the ways in which it was hard for his family, and also honoring his memory. So just dedicating this work to him. So today I'm going to do a lecture with a slideshow. And the slideshow really, there's a lot of information packed in there that I'm going to kind of gloss over, but it will be sent around and you'll be able to go into it and spend more time and follow all the different rabbit holes you'd like to follow. And then I'm going to open it up for some discussion. And then we're going to pull back and I'm going to offer 2 exercises that you can pour into your landscape in your life in the coming week. And then we'll open it again at the very end for more discussion, where we can bring experiences we've had this past week with our mentors, with letting the last session digest inside of us, kind of like mellow and ferment. So we'll have 2 different opportunities to talk. My grandfather's name was Alan Strand. Yeah, my last name is Strand, and it was Bjorkstrand in Germany before it came through Ellis Island, which I believe means some kind of wood or some kind of shoreline with wood along it. I'm not exactly sure. Okay, so I'm going to do screen sharing. Let's see if I can do this. Meeting, start share. Share. Okay, is that working, Cassandra?
Yes, we can see that lovely.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm gonna make it all very big. Here we go. Okay, so from breath to text, oral scripture and the transition to alphabetic abstraction. And so the real question here is, how does this shift? So most of human culture, knowledge transmission, not just stories, but every type of information, ecological, social, survival, practical knowledge was transmitted orally. And it's really only been very recently. We could say it's been since 3500 BCE, but really it's only been since 1440 CE and the invention of the printing press that literacy has been shaping culture. Literacy was not the predominant mode of information technology for most of human history. So what about this shift changes culture and changes human neurophysiology? So that's one of the questions that we're beginning to massage, especially as Jesus was an oral storyteller whose teachings get written down. What does that transition mean? Okay, so what is orality? What is textuality? Oral culture has no understanding of what a book is. It doesn't even understand that their words are single beings. Everything is continuous and connected by breath. There's no idea of meaning as following a line. Meaning flows from one body into another body. So I'm going to start with a couple of quotes that I really enjoy that kind of set the stage. One of them is from incredible media philosopher Marshall McLuhan, who wrote a lot about how information technology changes the way we think and make culture. That we think of information as getting poured into a tube, which is information technology, and then coming out intact the other side. But the truth is that when you pour information into a technology, the technology changes it, and it changes you at the other end. And that the most important thing sometimes is less the content of what you're receiving, and more the way you're receiving it. It's a very interesting idea. And so I'm going to start by saying that a lot of the big heroes of modern culture and modern textual culture actually warned against writing things down, that both Socrates and Plato said that writing things down would inhibit memory and inhibit improvisational, flexible thinking. And yet they've become kind of the emblematic of written culture. It's very interesting. Even in Jewish culture, in which texts were seen as sacred objects and were held in reverence, it was still seen as being problematic to offload all of your information into an object. You know, the letter kills, the spirit gives life, we read in one of Paul's letters. And I love this quote, which is, even a positive thing casts a shadow. It is, I'm having a hard time reading all of these things because of the screen. Can I minimize that? Yeah, there we go. Even a positive thing casts a shadow. Its unique excellence is at the same time its tragic flaw. Okay, so I'm going to start with this timeline of writing, but I'm not going to go through it case by case, especially because I think that you can spend time with it on your own when we send around the slides. But basically, we see writing begin with three-dimensional tokens that are meant to represent grain, animals, agricultural products that are about trading and agricultural surplus. So the first writing we see is in Sumer, in these tokens that then get flattened down to two-dimensional pictographs. And so the thing about pictographs is that they still, where do we have this? I think it's somewhere back here. Pictographs still represent the thing that they're talking about. There's still a one-to-one relationship between the thing you're looking at and the thing it represents. And so we see the beginning of writing in Sumer with these pictographs. And it really isn't until the end of the Bronze Age, a moment with incredible environmental disasters, social chaos, mass exoduses of people, collapse of civilizations, that we see the Greek alphabet really begin to take off as a popular information technology. Until then, it's still used in a kind of playful way that doesn't totally take over society. And so what I want to show in this timeline is how environmental and social conditions create the pressure cooker that makes us begin to adopt writing with more and more fervor. And at the very end, I'll discuss the sense that I have, which is that if you think of a culture as being like a body, that writing is a kind of survival mechanism to mass trauma, to natural disasters, to people dying with the eruptions of volcanoes, with droughts, and that there's a sense that culture can't last, so you have to offload it into something permanent. But the strange thing about it is it actually creates a culture where knowledge is less permanent. Okay, so we're going to go through this. And we're going to start with a deep time meditation and go back a little bit further than just Sumer. We're going to start with the hyoid bone. So according to David George Haskell, who just wrote a great book about the evolution of song and sound, we owe our human voices and their ability to shape complex sounds to milk and milk production in mammals. The milk produced by proto-mammalian mothers millions of years ago. Before the production of milk, youngsters were fed on forage material, sometimes they found on their own or their parents found, and they needed complex guts that digested this hearty food. So the scarcity of nourishment and the physical complexity in breaking down this food capped the ability of reproduction. But then there was this incredible invention around 200 million years ago, whereby mammals invented nutritive skin secretions called milk. But this new specialized protein and the way in which it was given changed the physiology and behavior of both mothers and their children. Children needed a specialized feeding apparatus. They needed their throats and the physiology of their throats to actually change so that they could suck. And it was specific to these throat changes and the hyoid bone that incidentally later on the same mechanism accidentally allowed us to form the exact words and sounds that we make today. No reptile can suck. Their mouths and tongues and throats are weak and they lack skeletal support. Their thin V-shaped hyoid bone in reptilian necks, through the necessity of sucking milk, became a stout four-fingered saddle with muscles attached to these fingers that stabilize the tongue, the mouth, the larynx, and the esophagus. So to this day, infants are born with a fully developed hyoid bones. The larynx imparts sound to air flowing up the windpipe from the lungs. And these sonic vibrations then stream into the upper part of your mouth, your windpipe, and your nasal cavities before intimately, in the shape of your interiority, flowing out to find listeners. The mammalian hyoid and its muscles allow animals to change the shape and the resonance of their throat and mouth, giving sound its particular timbre and nuance. The hyoid bone both supports the mouth and the tongue and anchors the larynx. So let's throw away the Eurocentric argument that speaking comes from the impulse to make meaning. Language rests on a molten stratum of appetite, a lush physical desire to suck and to eat and to depend on another being's body, to draw nourishment from relationship, to draw in sweetness. Language is an economy of appetites, an exchange of matter that builds and breaks down and rebuilds the world with food seeking, inhaling and exhaling and excreting bodies, an ongoing baking, making, consuming, and seeking of food. Let us enter into language as we enter into life by following our appetites and also knowing that something longs to eat us too. That eating and speaking, desiring and listening are all part of the same evolutionary metabolic exchange. So, anchoring back into the question, which is how does our world become so suppressed by a dominant extractive hierarchical system? We can look to the brain and we can look to the shift between oral cultures and textual cultures. So one of the big argument is that this violent and extractive mindset is caused by the shift from right brain thinking to left brain thinking that the alphabet creates. And there are a bunch of people who have mapped this out scientifically, anthropologically, in evolutionary biology. And one of the great proponents of it is this philosopher, Ian McGilchrist. In his book, The Master and the Emissary, he argues that Western culture has oscillated between left and right hemispheric approaches to the world, but that slowly over time, the left has taken control. And this allows for the emphasis on order, control, rationality, fragmentation, and bureaucracy, while the right is more gestalt and takes in everything at once and actually allows for a kind of open-minded cognition. It's interesting because we kind of need both. And there's another idea, which if you want, you can go down that rabbit hole of bicamerality, which is that we used to have both fused. And so that sometimes we could go into that left brain particular mindset that allowed us to pick out certain things and dampen other sensory stimuli. So we could tell which plant was the right one to eat, that we could understand our surroundings with a lot of specificity, but that the right hemisphere kept us open to incoming predators and surprises, and that we needed to oscillate between the two, but that we've become, through the rise of alphabetic culture, stuck in the left hemisphere. And one of my favorite proponents of this is actually a neurosurgeon and cultural critic, Leonard Schlein. And I would combine his approach with the more eco-philosophical approach of David Abram and The Spell of the Sensuous, which is that the rise of writing as technology fosters an actual neurological shift that moves from a holistic, synthetic, simultaneous, relational view of the world into a linear, sequential, reductionist, and abstract mode of cognition. You know, Schlein's interpretation is slightly gender essentialist. And he says, you know, of course, the right brain is feminine. And as we move into the left brain, we denigrate mother goddesses, relationality, earth reverence. Well, I think that it's correct that it changes the way we think. I don't think that gendering the brain is necessarily helpful. But his work has been wonderful at showing that, you know, as we move into alphabetic writing, we also see the rise of commercialized agricultural states, hierarchical structures, and mass violence. Oftentimes, as alphabets reach a society, we see mass violence. It's hard to know which comes first, but he makes a strong case that the use of abstract symbols, deracinated from contextual life worlds and real relationships, foster a kind of abstract thinking that allows us to disassociate from our ecologies and our social embeddedness and co-becoming. A spoken word in oral culture is breath. It is a verb, ephemeral, a happening. The thing spoken is also seen as a relational event. However, a written word made of fragmented letters that don't even represent real things, but represent partial sounds makes us believe that beings are objects, fragmented objects that we can own, deracinate from their life worlds. When we tell stories, it's a communal experience, but when we write, it is not communal. We write alone and we read alone. The solitary self begins to emerge philosophically and politically with the rise of literacy. We see Platonic forms hovering in an abstract world. So this is known as the alphabet effect. And there have been a lot of people who've written about it. David Abram, Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, Harold Innis. This class in particular is really structured around the work of Walter Ong. And I've included his book in the resources. And I think that he's done really great work at kind of mapping at how the cognitive shifts that happen when you stop telling stories in community and start writing them down. So this is a great quote by another person, Robert Logan, who studied the alphabet effect, showing that the medium of the communication changes the culture. Okay, so I'm positioning myself with Walter Ong at the end of oral culture. So let's locate ourselves in the Mediterranean basin, which is where Jesus is finally going to arrive. And the end of the oral culture can be seen crystallized in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And there was an amazing American classicist who in 1928 disrupted the whole world of classical and literary studies by showing that the Odyssey and the Iliad had not been written texts originally, that they had been created with cliches and epithets and standardized phrases so that they could be remembered and performed orally, and that they hadn't even been written probably by a single author, that they had been a shared cultural event that was resurrected each time a new person stepped into the role of Homer. That Homer was I think we talked about this in the last session, a holobiont of many different storytellers. The great poem is composed of standardized phrases and plot formulas grouped around standardized themes. And so the word used to describe what these poets did was rhapsodize, which comes from the Greek rhapsoidos, which means to stitch the songs together. So we can go back to that mycelial capability, which is when you pour fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, into an ecosystem, they form the shape of relationships. They stitch together trees, orchids, bacterial communities. They're not creating one narrative, they're creating a map of many different narratives. And so that's what a storyteller would do, is they would stitch together the songs. There was no idea of an individual author. The author would come in with their standard phrases, with these episodes, with these characters, these gods, these cliches and familiar metaphors, and then they would create their own version of the story. They would pour themselves into these standardized phrases and then improvise around it, which is really, really interesting. Paradoxically, it is the reliance on these set formulas and themes that allows oral poetry to move and gives that opening space for people to improvise each time they tell the story. So you would read your audience. The most amazing thing about oral storytelling is you are always able to be interrupted by the environment, by a storm, by people telling you that you're telling the story wrong. And you also have to be a good storyteller, and then you have to read the room. You have to read the weather. You have to read the political, the social, and the ecological factors that will necessitate you changing the story. It's very, very interesting. And so Orpheus is also a great example of a kind of Homeric figure, which is that there was this collection of Orphic hymns that were all attributed to Orpheus, but even Socrates and Plato knew that this hadn't just been Orpheus. You didn't pray to Orpheus, you stepped into the role and wrote a poem as Orpheus. You became the poet, you began to channel the story, but you did it by having a standard understanding of what the cliches and episodes and characters and sayings were that you could stitch together. Okay, so yeah, we already went through pictographs and the shift into phonetic alphabets. Yeah, here we are. So another really interesting thing is when you're reading a book, you can always look back at the last page. If you're reading a sentence, you can always look back. So that encourages a kind of speed, a kind of linearity, always driving forward, never thinking about the past, never being responsible for the past. But in oral culture, you have nothing to turn back to. So you have to be constantly looping episodes. Like you will end a story, but you need to go retell the beginning of it so that people understand it. Knowledge has to be constantly repeating and updating and looping so that it stays alive. If you don't keep it alive in your breath and keep repeating it, it disappears. And so a lot of times these epics will have very, in terms of modern ideas, non-normal, non-normative narrative structures that I've been calling them holarchic epics, because they tend to be these constellations of episodes rather than a climactic linear narrative. The Iliad and the Odyssey are composed like nested boxes rather than a climactic linear narrative. And this mirrors the way that life actually exists in nested biomes. The microbes in your gut, you in the forest with the microbes in your gut, the forest nested in a greater landscape that then in turn is nested in the world. In science, this nesting is called holarchy, and it is also true of most oral epics. They have formulaic tendencies to repeat at the end of an episode, elements from the beginning of the episode, closing the loop. The poet could string together episodes, nest one episode in another, loop them together in ways that created complex ecosystems of relationship rather than an individual drive towards a conclusive ending. There was no true ending to an epic oral story. There was always the expectation that it would be told again, continued the next night. And when you would continue it the next night, you couldn't flip the book back to the last chapter. So you'd often retell, probably a little bit differently, the last episode. So there's this recursiveness, this involution, this always turning back and forward. And in an interesting way, these epics represent life much better than the types of narratives that we're creating now. So Marshall McLuhan saying the medium is the message. We start to live in this inorganic way when we start writing stories that are linear, that never look backwards, that are never held accountable to what happened yesterday, that are not accountable to an audience and to a weather system and to an ecological and social context. So my question is, why did we shift from this flexible, context-sensitive, and durable mode of knowledge transmission into something more abstract, more available to ossification, and ultimately more perishable? And that ties back to the beginning when my personal belief, as I've been working with this history for a long time, is that it's a survival mechanism, it's a trauma response that then becomes enshrined in culture. You know, Resma Menachem says that, a trauma response over time, over generations, becomes culture. Okay, so spoken words are events of breath, not fragmented letters. Sound only exists when it is going out of existence. When you say the word immortal or permanence, the perm is gone by the time you get to the it has to be gone to make room for the next syllable. Spoken words are always happenings, occurrences, breath that passes away, an event that enters us, carried by breath, imprinted by another body's physical interior. Sound can't be held or owned. It always happens inside time. This original impermanence of language, and thus the meaning carried by the language, underlines adaptability, changeability, the passing of time, and the inability to own information or meaning. It underlines death and an inhalation of otherness as the ontological ground for the next breath and the next sound. One sound must end for another to begin. So in oral culture, when you have to create all of these different interconnected episodes, when every time you're updating and passing along the knowledge, it involves an audience who can interact with you and an environment that can impinge and change what's being said, it involves totalizing, creating relationships, rhapsodizing and stitching together social cohesion, environmental embeddedness. In requiring a listener in a context, it stitches together real relationships. On the other hand, textual cultures dissect word from what it represents, writer from reader, teller from audience. But the basic orality of language is permanent. Language will always be rooted in mouths and breaths and in orality. Writing is a secondary modeling system based on the primary modeling system of orality as being an embodied activity. Orality mostly exists without writing in history. I think it's like only 2% of all languages that have ever been spoken have writing, probably, which is important to put in context. All writing has its root system in actual bodies interacting with breath and with their environments. Orality is the root system of all writing. So if in this course we're trying to look back into the healthier root system, orality is that root system underneath all of these Eurocentric, academic, sterile, abstracted, Platonic ideas. So abstractly sequential, classificatory, explanatory examination of phenomena or of stated truths is impossible without reading or writing. It would never even come into your brain. In oral cultures, there's a vast reserve of really practical wisdom, but this wisdom isn't offloaded into objects. It exists in relationships that are constantly having to be updated so that the knowledge stays in breath, is transmitted to someone else so that they can keep telling it. And it's also always responding to the situation where you are, to your ecological embeddedness. Oral cultures don't study uprooted information. They don't hold it as an object and study it. They don't master it or dominate it. Knowledge cannot be owned. It's always an event that happens in the space between. Textual cultures study. In fact, when you see alphabets arrive, the first thing they study is usually themselves. They usually study the alphabet. And so it's interesting that when you get writing, you get a kind of solipsism. You turn away from the world and inwards. In oral cultures, you don't study, you apprentice with people and plants and places, with elders who are teaching you the stories that will teach you how to stay alive. So the thing that I've been really, really interested in is that as we begin to enclose meaning and words in text, we also begin to enclose fields and animals and plants. And one of the most interesting things about oral cultures is that they have seemingly smaller vocabularies than written cultures, but this is because each word is directly rooted in the existence of a real being or a real relationship. It's like a lot of money these days has no gold backing behind it, nothing behind it. It's all abstract. So it seems like there's a lot of money, but there's not actually anything behind it. In oral cultures, there is gold backing behind each word. Behind each word is a real relationship or a real being. Oral cultures have ecologies rather than encyclopedias, living, breathing webs of verbal relationship where everything said directly relates to the specific needs of a community and its relationships to geology, to plants, and to daily survival. But most of the words in written cultures are word hoards, surplus words, uprooted words stolen from other cultures. Too many words to be held in a web of relationship or a single brain. These word hoards are uprooted from their relational and ecological context and then offloaded into objects, into dictionaries and reference books. These words often refer to abstractions that cannot be found within a 10-mile radius of your home, let alone in the material world writ large. They relate to no lived reality in your day-to-day existence. We have huge vocabularies we cannot remember because they are not practically useful. We collect words we have never lived or smelled or slept beside. So as we begin to collect, to have agricultural, so we stop living nomadic lifestyles and we start to live in cities and we start to create monocrops that then create agricultural surplus that we have to figure out how to take care of, who owns it. As we start to create agricultural surplus and hoard that, we start to hoard words as well. You know, we can trace the beginning of writing back to this need to actually count how many cows we have, how many bushels of grain do we have, and we can remember those actual tokens in Sumer. Yeah, but it's very interesting as we move from these tokens that are three-dimensional then into these two-dimensional pictographs that still have some kind of relationship to a life world. You know, the picture of the ox represents the ox, but then the really big leap that really changes in my belief system and in Walter Ong and a lot of these other scholars who have mentioned is when we stop using pictographs and we start using phonetic letters that are just based on fragmented syllables. You know, finally, the alphabet is fully abstracted from representational images, uproots us from life worlds. But in oral cultures, you would never think to create a list because lists are not durable. They don't have, you know, one of the big things that I always want to stress is that in oral cultures, knowledge is situational, not categorical. You know, knowledge has to do with a situation that you're responding to and with all of the different components. You know, oral cultures totalize, they see the whole picture. So they would never create a list where there was no relationship between each thing in the list. You couldn't remember it. They don't have any meaning. Even transmitted genealogies that we see in the Bible, and the Bible is the final step in a long oral tradition. They don't have listed genealogies. There's a begat. You need the connective tissue of a verb. So Samuel begat Abraham. You know, and usually it happens in a specific place. So you need a relationship and you need a verb and you need a place. So oral cultures do not itemize. They rhapsodize and stitch together. They would never put together a list that was deracinated from their context, from their situational knowledge. So one of the most beautiful things about oral cultures is the fact that it is a real somatic experience. And I also want to stress here that signing and sign language is part of this whole experience, because sign language is about connecting relationships. It's embodied, it's bodies reading other bodies. There's always going to be another person reading your body with their body. And so the thing I love about sound is that it interiorizes. And it interiorizes in a way that is definitely not material reductionist. It's not about cutting apart. Hearing can register interiority without violating it. You can thump a box to find out whether it is hollow or solid without entering the box. You can ring a coin to learn whether it's silver or lead. Sounds register interior structure of whatever it is that produces them. A saxophone is shaped differently than a flute and it produces a different sound. And above all, the human voice comes from inside the human organism, which provides the voice's resonance. Sight can isolate in order to locate. And as we're isolating these fragmented syllables on this white page, suddenly we're completely disembodied. Sound, though, manifests human beings to each other as conscious interiors. It affirms the reality of another being's interior experience, the shape and texture of it. This understanding of other people's interiority tends to create tight-knit groups. And these tight-knit groups are kept alive by elders. What happens to elders when we move from orality to textuality? So this to me seems like kind of one of the biggest shifts. And for me, this also helps alphabetic culture gain dominance really fast, because when you lose this reserve of wisdom really quickly, all that's left is the new. Since in primary oral culture conceptualized knowledge that is not repeated aloud soon, oral cultures must invest great energy in saying over and over again what has been learned arduously over the ages. So this means you have to have community meetings a lot with a lot of people who are learning the stories, learning the epithets so that they can rhapsodize like Homer and stitch them together. And usually the people who hold these vast reserves of incredibly precious knowledge are the elders. So in oral culture, there's a great reverence for the elders. The elders are the center of these community gatherings that would happen all the time in order to keep knowledge, practical knowledge, cultural, ecological, farming knowledge alive. But when you start storing knowledge outside the mind, offloading it into objects, and even more in print, you downgrade the figures of the elders. You don't need them anymore. Elders become objects. And this is always favoring younger people who are better at using this increasingly deracinated technology. And for me, what seems most important is, and this is what we're really, really stressing in this course, is when the alphabet first arrives, it's more of a playful, ecologically embedded technology. And I think we can apply this to a lot of technologies we see today, which is they're not good or bad, but when they start to be used in more and more intense ways, they can create great harm. So when alphabets are first created, they're created, it's the Proto-Canaanite and then the Semitic alphabet. And it's really, really important to explain that this original Semitic alphabet had no vowels. It was still ecologically entangled with the life world from which it emerged. Which is really, really crucial. This lack of vowels meant that it was hard to determine what word you were reading without an intimate knowledge of the world the language inhabited, the patterns of diction and language, the things that might be said, how things were supposed to sound, that it was, what you were reading didn't actually represent the meaning you were trying to understand until you poured in the breath and the actual cultural context. So the alphabet was used more as a place with which to fill breath, with life world, within which you were embedded. However, another amazing fact is, like, even to this day, in schools where Hebrew is taught, these instructive vowels, like points above the letters, must be added until children have the cultural understanding to be able to pour their breath into the language. So what I see is really interesting is in this initial Semitic alphabet, there's still that open space for breath. There's still that open space for a life world. It always has to be contextually rooted. To access these early alphabets, you must first access that relational and environmental context. But Greeks come in, and the Greeks that become the Romans are really going to be the people who we're putting a lot of the blame on. There's some interesting things they do, but they also are very, very good at, like we said in the first one, they came in to the Mediterranean basin and co-opted all this older mythology, and they came into the Semitic alphabet and they co-opted it and they added vowels, and that is really the key shift. The vocalic Greek alphabet was more remote from the world. It analyzed sound more abstractly into purely spatial components. It could be used to write or read words even from a language one did not know. It said exactly the word that you read, so there was no need of extra contextual information. And you could go and use it as a tool to colonize other languages. And so after Alexander the Great has his conquest of the Mediterranean basin, Greek is used as a colonial tool to go in and take over civilizations, to steal their words, to steal their concepts and translate them into Greek. The Greek language was internationalizing in that it provided a way of processing even foreign tongues. The Greek achievement in abstractly analyzing the elusive world of sound into visual equivalents both presaged and implemented both their further intellectual exploits and, I would say, their imperial mindset. I would say that Greek language creates the conceptual tool of empire. This. And the place I want to end this part of the lecture with is that writing, we have this idea now that because everyone reads, pretty much everyone reads, that writing is just this ubiquitous practice, and that once it was developed, everybody practiced it. But you have to realize that until the printing press, and actually until probably the last 200 years, most cultures were high oral residue cultures. There were still practically oral cultures, and that writing is usually only practiced by people with the leisure time and the social currency and the money to be able to learn writing and then learn how to use it and then create the text that lasts. So usually it has written culture, and written artifacts always represent an elite bias. So if we're looking at the Gospels and we're looking at the Bible, we're going to keep in mind that this is written culture that was produced by the elite subsection of a much larger population of people. And so Jesus was not part of this elite culture. He was from northern Palestine, and northern Palestine was much less literate than the much more scholarly population around Judea in southern Palestine. And even in Judea, in the more scholarly elite population, archaeologist William G. Deaver estimates that it probably would have only been a 2% literacy rate at the time of Jesus. So Jesus is a person who is telling stories to illiterate peasants in a culture that has been sustained through breath. That even though it gets written down, the way it's been kept alive and the way it's considered to be active is through constant interpretation. That during the time period, it was through targums, through interpretations that happened face to face with other people studying the Torah, that knowledge was kept alive. You had to infuse it with your breath, your spirit, to keep the information adapting to your political and social circumstances. So we actually see in the Old Testament people going back in again and again and reinterpreting things to update it to their, to the Babylonian Exodus. So they're constantly using older stories, putting their breath into them and adapting them. I mean, I was also looking at the root of the word word, which then will, in the Gospel of John, be used to describe Jesus. And that was not a written word. Debar meant spoken and breath-infused utterance. It also meant the place of wording, the place where things were given their intimate meaning. So it also was used to denote the place where you would begin to farm in wilderness, where you would plant the seed of food production in wilderness. So for me, word, if we plant it, take it out of Greek, take it out of Roman culture and plant it back in its Galilean context, in its vowel-less language and alphabet, begins to show us that there's something much healthier and richer and more biodiverse underneath the word. Okay, so I'm gonna stop share, come back. That's a lot of information. And I want to take a break and open up space for both questions and reflections. And then we're going to pull back and I'm going to give us an exercise, but I just want to let us mutually digest these ideas. So please jump into the chat or unmute yourself and let's talk.
What's been incredible that's kind of weaving together in my mind, as you've been talking about the progression, and what seems to be the cheapening of, as it goes from needing that interaction, needing the relationship, needing the breath, going into the written words, going into the fragmented words, then having the vowels. I can't help but think just about now the level of cheapening that the technology has added into this progression of, now not only is the word written on a paper, not only is the paper available in multiple books, not only is that like word, now it's like infinitely available, to as many eyes that can see, and how much we lose the original relationship and meaning in that, and how that really is a devastating moment.
You want to know something insane? And I could have done a whole class on this. So, the assembly line, the mechanical assembly line, is how a lot of modern industrial capitalism functions. You want to know what the first instance of it is? Mechanically reproduced typeset. So print culture, alphabetic culture, is the genesis of assembly line culture. And this, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction by Walter Benjamin. I mean, I'll send that essay around. It's an incredible meditation on what you're talking about, which is, what does it mean when you pretend knowledge is reproducible and that you can take it out of its context and that it can somehow mean the same thing to someone else? It's a kind of violence. It's an extractive process.
I love that you brought up that essay. I actually worked for a company called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So
yeah, and also Simulation and Simulacra by Baudrillard. There are a couple, I should just remember, Cassie, if you can remember to remind me to include links to these. There have been some interesting meditations on this very question. Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like this like Mayday moment to get back to the relational aspect of sharing stories.
And someone said, I actually think that we're seeing returns, like classes like this. In an interesting way, COVID, rooting us in place, forced us to actually have to interact face-to-face on Zoom. And so things became much more oral. So there's also like, we never want to totally demonize something. Like, so weirdly enough, COVID technology has opened up the space for orality. And there's been a rise of podcasts. Matthew. Literacy, okay, Matthew's asking about literacy. Yeah, literacy is like a very colonial term, and it's been used actually by Western academics to say that like one culture's thing is not literacy and something is. I don't even like it as a term. I think literate is a chirographic term, and that outside of textual cultures, everything is considered meaningful rather than some things being high art, some things being low art. And so, yeah, I have a real problem with literacy. I would say that everything is meaningful outside of a textual culture where some things are correct speech. And in fact, we look at literate cultures, you never want to pause. You're always repeating yourself. You're always doing things wrong. You're always doing in a way, transmitting information in a way that inside of our ideas of what literature is would be considered incorrect. Bonfire game where we read each other's poems out loud. Yeah, it's amazing. I was thinking, like, of course, the best information is the stuff that happens over a dinner table and over shared food. And where we're going to originally end up is that Jesus's main teachings are none of the things that come to us in the gospel, and they're all actually situational, which is shared food, storytelling over shared food. And so sometimes I think that we've been outside of that culture in COVID for a long time. How can we bring back to life sharing a meal and sharing our most important information over that shared food? Yeah, Zora Neale Hurston has done incredible thinking about this. Absolutely. She wrote a great essay. I'm going to see if I can find it and send it along too. Chirographic, yeah. It's spelled chirographic, and it's just the term for cultures that use alphabetic texts. So you'll see it in a lot of the books I've recommended. That's the term they'll use. You could interchangeably use it with textual. Okay. Yeah, I think, okay, so here's something interesting. Lynn Walter is talking about truth. I wrote something while I was thinking about this class, which is that in oral cultures, this understanding that truth is always flexible and up to date, because every time you change it, every time you tell it, it's changing to adapt to a situation. So you see truth as being relational and evolving. And inside of a written culture, where something becomes a stable object, truth becomes this static thing that never changes. That seems very dangerous to me. Sophie, can you see the hands? I can't see the hands. How do I, Cassandra, will you help me with that? I'm bad at, all right, here. Julie?
Yes, absolutely. We can start with Drew.
Yeah.
And also if anyone would like to unmute themselves.
Yeah, that's maybe the best way is to just unmute yourself and do it.
Yeah, it flows quite well that way. So when you feel ready, you can just sort of unmute yourself and I'll spotlight you and you can have a conversation with Sophie.
I'll dive in.
Yeah.
If that's okay.
Great,
okay.
Go for it.
Can you see me? Okay, so yeah, Adrian, one of the things I was thinking about in terms of what you were talking about with literacy and how that sort of, that disassociation that comes along with literacy. a huge part of me taking this course is, deconstructing my evangelical upbringing, which I'm sure I'm not alone in that. But one of the things that it's really kind of struck me over the last couple of years is just the extent to which evangelical culture that I was raised in is just so sees empathy as such a threat to their truth. And I think this idea of like rerouting our stories in relationality is such an important part of how we sort of rediscover just parts of our religion that we have really severed in that sort of post-enlightenment moment. A story that has been really grounding for me, and I know we're not really at the Bible yet, but the story of Peter and his vision and the way that he takes that vision to the Council of Jerusalem, and just to think that so much of what we consider orthodoxy is actually rooted in an empathetic relationship with the other in community. And I just kind of feel like, you take that story and it seems so foreign to the way in which Christianity gets practiced. And so, I don't know if you wanted to add to that. It was just kind of a thought that I had, and just in the way in which our sort of dogma and religion is so rational and so disassociated and so filled with a cognitive dissonance that we really, there are people who genuinely sort of see empathy as a threat. Like, I think of this in terms of, queer exclusion in church right now would be a good example of that. And the way in which, to listen to people's real lived experiences is really sort of seen as antithetical to the truths that people are trying to hold on to. Anyway, so I think it was just a reflection. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that, but I just think that there's just so much room here to, the idea of re-embodying our faith within community, within, our own bodies, within sort of, ecology, to kind of rebuild some of those strands of connection that have been sort of severed through that sort of rational literalism, I think is really important.
Thank you. Yeah. I also think when you write something down on a page, neither you need everyone is referring to it. No one is actually at stake. No one's actually having to say, I'm saying this to you and you're responding to me. A text can't be questioned. And so, of course, yeah, there's no empathy. There's no actual relationality that's being built in. And if we think of Marshall McLuhan's quote, the medium is the message, and we look at what Jesus was doing, what is his medium? His medium is in-person storytelling. And if that's not what we're doing, then we're probably not getting in touch with what he was trying to actually teach. That will be the fourth module as far as really think about, what does it mean that if the medium is the message, what does it mean that this was his medium? Yeah. I want to look at Julia Wallent's Adapting the Reformation in Europe and Latin. But here's the thing about the Reformation is that actually what it was an iconoclasm. So you destroyed all the images and all the folk practices and actually killed millions of Jewish people. Let's get rid of all the witches were killed. It was actually a super intense anti-Semitic genocide, and all of the queer people and all the people who were not part of the dominant kind of enlightened view. So I would say that the movement to the Reformation is actually the movement into intense violence, and Leonard Shlain really, really documents this in The Alphabet and the Goddess. That's where you see alphabetic literacy and violence really cohere. Yeah, there's this common misconception that democratized language. Actually, some of the initial texts that were published were these maleficorums, these ways of identifying Jewish people as being devils and witches. So the printing press actually inaugurates massive violence. The first texts that are widely disseminated are ways to identify who to kill.
So am I allowed to pop in, or is this
Please, yeah, go. Hi, Tada.
Oh, hey, what's up? So man, what I feel actually right now is just it's such a heavy subject for me, but the Africanist traditions of orality. So when you're talking about oral cultures and text cultures, you see that all across America right now, because the Africanist cultures, the brown cultures, if you talk about Jesus being a brown man,
yeah,
right, we are living in a state, or where there's a dissociation between orally based popular Africanist cultures and the writing intelligentsia, which me and everybody else here are probably a part of it at some level, and of course there's a crossover, right? But something that's been really interesting to me in this kind of navigation and exploration of who the fuck was Jesus? Like, what the fuck is he actually like? And the more and more I think about it, these are some of the tangents I've been on, is like, Jesus is probably like Kendrick Lamar.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
right? Because, and you know what I mean? Like, he's not even chosen, maybe. He might have to prove himself in a circle. He's like, yo, like,
Exactly.
okay, I'm gonna prove you with my timing. I'm the fucking chosen one. It's not, it's in the timing and the rhythm and the cadence that he's delivering. And so that was really interesting to hear today. Yeah, yeah.
Tada, you're picking up on the major theme of this course, which is the only way you could inspire this many people is if you had incredible physical intelligence and were so good at not talking to other elite people, but Galilean peasants. So you had to be like an incredible rhetorical embodied presence to be able to convince people. The fact that these things have made it this far is not because they were some kind of literary artifact, it's because there was a human body who was great at performing. And actually, what we're going to see is he was part of this Northern Mosaic tradition. So there are actually many different traditions of Judaism at that time period. We have part of the violence that Christianity's done is it's homogenized Judaism at that time period into one thing. It was so complex. And there was this tradition up there of these storytelling magicians who, when we look at their teachings, we can actually see that they invoked a lot of Walter Ong writes about this in Orality and Literacy. They invoked the body. Karen Armstrong also writes about this, that they would reference moving in certain ways so that your message had a lot to do with actually how you move your body. Like, we've taken Jesus away from his body, but his body is probably what convinced people that he was worth listening to.
Right. And this is kind of like where the place where I've been thinking of like the Kabbalah. And so Jesus probably actually had to prove himself like, yo, all my Sephira are filled up right now by actually delivering. And the mystics of that time were actually a lot more like hip hop artists who would actually have to prove each other and diss each other in circles.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, if you look at the text we have, he was dissed a lot.
Right.
And people were always saying, you're full of shit. And he would be like, you want to know what? You're never believed in your mom's town. No one ever likes you in your mom's town. I'm going to Capernaum. Like, yeah, no. So if we actually look at like the texture of this, we see someone who is frustrated, angry, good at telling stories, good at engaging a really, really rowdy audience of people who have been subjected to daily violence and were not easily convinced. And I think that's another thing is these people would, and this is what we're going to really focus on in the fourth module, is like, these are people who've been so oppressed and so violently impinged that actually convincing them that you were not full of shit would be hard. And that if they just took these parables as given, it wouldn't work. They actually had to inspire outrage.
And I think this is a really interesting part where at least us think about, like, I think you talk about heroes being a mycelial network as opposed to individual. And I think it starts to me break down in terms of like, Jesus was just probably one famous rapper out of a movement of rappers.
And there were, and that's another thing we're going to talk about, is that there were so many other people at that time period who were doing the same thing. One of the interesting questions we'll arrive at is, why him? Because there were actually a lot of other people healing people, telling stories, goading the Roman Empire. It's actually kind of strange that he's the person that people remember most. Tada, thank you. You basically like encapsulated this course, which is that Jesus was like an embodied rapper convincing people that his music was the best music, that everyone should be making music.
All right.
Okay, so I think, does anyone else have let's do a couple more questions. Come on. Who's next?
So I've been thinking about how we receive information in our culture. And I really loved how, and I've been thinking about this a long time, how you carried forth the oral tradition and the alphabet and the meanings in the ecosystem and so on. And then how it shifted. And I paid a lot of attention to David Abrams, and he has really beautiful information about that. But my experience in working with children is that they're not getting their information. We have a huge part of our culture right now that's not getting our information from reading. We're getting it from cell phones and from text well, not even, mostly pictures, and we're getting it from movies. And it's coming to us in chunks of like, okay, this movie's about this, and this movie's about that, and this one's going to get these neurotransmitters going, and this one's going to get that one going, and we're going to sell you some soap, and then we're going to sell you some cars, and then we're going to sell you some video games, and we're going to get you hyped up this way and that way, and everything's in sort of neurological chunks. So then when I come in as a teacher and I'm trying to teach reading, kids are like, what? You know, I'm getting my information from my friends who, you know, talk about this song or that, you know, they're not really that interested in stringing together information in the same way that we did like in an oral tradition. And it takes a lot of warming the material and really getting people to settle in as human beings in a group of souls to really transmit oral information, and then to wake up the idea of written information. So I'm just bringing that as my observation at this point, is that we're now evolving into something else.
Yeah.
Our brains are changing. And when I look at the children, I would say 40 to 50% of them are not particularly interested in being literate in our country. So it's just a comment. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think of that moment where the Greeks, where it's the fall of the Bronze Age, and we have all civilization collapse, and we have the rise of linear B, which is the Greek alphabet with vowels, and the rise of high literacy in the wake of complete cultural breakdown. You know, many people point to that as being a moment with consciousness shift, where there's a neurophysiological shift between right brain to left brain, or that there's a bicameral breakdown, which is another idea. And I think we're in a moment like that right now, which is that we're having such intense media shifts so quickly that we can only sense that we must know that they're doing something to the way we think, that they're changing the way we think. And I really suggest reading the Marshall McLuhan that I'm going to include in the resources, which points that media shapes culture and shapes thinking. It shapes what thinking is possible. And so we're in a moment like that. I mean, I don't think written texts are going to exist for very long, or technology. I actually think we're probably heading into a time where we're going to need to learn how to put a lot of information about survival into densely packed narratives that can travel through ecological and social collapse. Because actually the most durable forms of information are oral. There's a 37,000-year-old Aboriginal tale still told to this day that has accurate information about a real geological asteroid hit. Like, that's the most durable form of information we have on the planet, or stories that are densely created to carry information great distances. I think I'm going to go to the exercises next. I'm going to look at this one last thing in there. Go to the exercises next, then we're going to pull back and do more talking. I am of an oral minority. Most of our culture, yeah, there's a divide between writing it down to preserve. Yeah, I know. This is something I think about a lot, is like how to keep it alive when colonialism has come in and destroyed your language and made it impossible to transmit. And how do you preserve it? I would say, I don't know. This is a question I've been thinking about a lot, which is, you know, the poet Robert Bringhurst, who I like, has done a lot to preserve the Haida language, but he's done it in a way that is complicated. It's been kind of extractive, and he's written it all down. You lose something when you do that. How do you like go to your elders and record them speaking these things, learn the stories, put them into your body, tell them to other people? How do stories travel? I'm not sure. Yeah. I think this is the primary question of this course that I think is going to emerge, which is like, how does your language stay alive? How do your stories travel? Because we're heading into a moment of incredible change. Okay, so these are the exercises that think about these very questions that I'm going to offer for this coming week. So the first one is called rerouting the words. And I will send around the documents of these texts so you'll be able to actually refer back to them and look at them. The mist is grief thick, and it does not acknowledge the boundaries of your skin. As you move through it, struggling to remember where you are, you feel it shift into your cells. Your entire material grows glaucous. Your own feelings are obscure, glimmering like abstract embers in your hands, your throat, your thighs. At first, the feeling is similar to consuming a glass of wine, but without any of the fuzz and glow. Everything softens, desaturates. Simultaneously, you are heavy and smooth, slipping forward as if gravity did not press you down from above, but hurried you forward into some strange state suspended between liquid and gas. And then there is no mist inside or out. There is only body without any word for whatever transformation it may be approaching. Yes, there are sounds, no longer contained by your brain. They echo through the cathedral of your whole body. Elongated susurrations that live in your spine do not originate from any of your human ancestors. Glottal slurps, buzzes, and jackhammer snaps, grating shrieks that speak of geological lovemaking at the pace of an ice age, glacier rubbing its rock-studded haunches slowly, ever so slowly, across the stretch of the valley. Stop. The memory of the dream erases the dream. Fresh snow fallen on fresh snow. You have no name, stranger, you have no name for name, no name even for loss. Every word you ever used is sucked out of you, leaving behind a void space that can finally resonate like a well-made instrument. Funny that the words have kept you too densely packed to make music. Now that you are open, the wind moves into your interiors, playing your shape into something well beyond meaning, something that can float, that can ride breath between species without any worry of mistranslation. What would it feel like to have all of your words erased? Every single one. And then, right before that event, to be told that you could have 50 words back when you returned, but they had to be 50 necessary words. You would never be able to increase that amount or learn more. They would be words for daily survival, for getting things done, for the most important, the most deeply rooted relationships in your actual life world. What 50 words make your world happen? What are the 50 words, not that you consider most beautiful or ethically important, but the words that do actual work? What are your 50 most necessary words? Pick carefully. And when you are done, observe that they are rarely platonic ideals or abstractions. The words actually important to our survival tend to come from actual relationships between our food, our caretakers, our community members, our loved ones. You can repeat this exercise as many times as you want, but I challenge you to be really careful, and each time you do it, to discard again and again the words that arrive from a sense of morality or pure poetry. What words would you need back as fast as you could if you woke up completely blank? Where are the nouns and verbs of urgency that erupt from your body and your body's relational existence? What are the 50 necessary words? What are the plants you need in your garden to survive? The animals on whom you depend? So that's the first idea, which is we were talking about how in oral cultures, they seemingly have smaller vocabularies, but they're real vocabularies. Every word has gold backing. Every word has a real relationship and a real sustained world of wisdom below it. Okay, I just want to look at the comments. Yes, Oceana, oracular capacity is part of the tapestry of obtaining excellence. Yes, and that's something we need to, people who've been from Europe, who've been inside of this textual abstractive culture, we need to learn how to do that again. We need to learn from you and from this culture. Find it easier to focus when listening and doing things, especially walking, than just sitting and reading. Me too. We learn best actually through movement and through walking. Like it's been shown that when you're walking and you're listening to something, it's easier to remember. Yeah, interesting. Homeschooling. Okay, and then I'm gonna have the final the final exercise. It's a system of accounting. Yes, in Walter Ong's book, he says when you go to high oral residue cultures, especially like some of the last ones were in Africa, and they would ask you, like, what do you think of the, was an actual example. I can find the page. They asked this woman, said, what do you think of the new principal? And she said, well, let's see how he dances. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly, those are the questions we need to ask. Not like, can he perform well in a test? But the question is, how well does he dance? Okay, yeah, tribal seniors.
I just want to illuminate this point just a little
Please.
bit.
Yeah, go for it.
The movement is part of it. And ta-da, you know, feel free to wade in here with me on this, but it's more like the capacity to communicate with your entire, not just even body, with your like, with all of your ancestry, your environment, the stuff in your space, all your history, the context, the capacity to communicate in any given moment to a body of people, a concept that is itself authentic, compelling, and true. That is a marker. That's a way you obtain excellence in the culture. And I know that African culture, diasporic culture, is not the only culture that has that. I believe the Judaic culture also has a similar rite of passage, you know, a way of being. But I just wanted to I wanted to fill that out a little bit more. And you're doing great. I'm just really digging this. And
please,
and you are everything.
Oh yeah, like in Asian cultures, like for example, if you're going to study with a teacher and they're a martial arts master, first thing you do is going to try to punch him and putting you on your ass. And then you're like, okay, you're my teacher. And if you're smart, you already know he's the master and you're not going to fuck around. But I think it's a very similar system, is how does your body embody this thing that you're communicating? It is like your body is a message. And there's a whole systems of organizing societies through kind of competency of the body. And of course, that's not 100% measure of somebody's competency, but I think it's a lot more accurate measure of how somebody can lead, because it's about their sense of timing. It's about their sense of breadth, through responsiveness to threat and all these things. And this is so lacking in our political system today. It's actually like, you know, this is like a cultural divide that we're in. So, yeah, no.
Oceana, I mean, I was immediately struck by, I was thinking about how the elders in an oral culture have to be able to go back and channel all the ancestors. Like they're always like this multi-causal event of ancestry, many different times, the wind, the breath, that they're kind of the node through which the entire environment passes. And I feel like that's what you were just saying so eloquently. If you want to write something about that and then offer it to the class so we can like have and write something about it. And that's part of the paradox of all of this. Like, listen to me. I'm like, I want you to write this down, but maybe you shouldn't. If you want to record something, I feel like that's the sensibility that we're going to try and access with ecological storytelling, is like, how do you're right. It's not just the body. It's about accessing many polytemporalities of ancestry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this whole piece around the rise of empire, and how the written word is sort of endemic to that, causal.
Yeah, I mean, we see the Greeks come in and co-opt all these other cultures, and then they come into, I mean, I think it's so interesting to think about the alphabet as being this animistic, environmentally embedded Jewish practice. The empire then comes in, puts vowels in, and uses the empire. Like, what? And I also want to hesitate and say that a lot of texts about the rise of the alphabet are really anti-Semitic. And they put everything on that original alphabet, and it's just not true. So I really want to highlight that. It's just not true. It's the Greeks and it's the vowels. Okay. I'm going to do the last exercise, and then we're just going to open it up and go for as long as we want. Okay, so this last one comes from this idea of geomythology. And so geomythology is this idea that long-standing myths are oftentimes more reliable information about older geological occurrences than any kind of scientific information, and they actually often predate scientific information. I'm going to include an essay I wrote about this that actually like lists a lot of cases of this. But what it shows is that myth is a highly accurate way of taking information and transmitting it through bodies and through time. So this is called boats of breath, constructing your ark. We live in an age when Noah's flood is no longer mythological, but probable. Even if we manage to cap emissions and radically halt extractive practices, we will see sea levels rise and radical climate change in the years to come. Change is coming that will, in all likelihood, radically alter the way we transmit knowledge, offload our information onto technology, while also dislocating us from the locations we have used as mnemonic devices. When the waters swallow our material possessions, our digital personas and encyclopedias, when the very survival of our species, let alone our familial and ancestral stories, seems bound for a bottleneck, if not an extinction, how do we decide what to save? So I now invite you to look back at your list of 50 necessary words that at this point you may have already begun to play with, the words that provide the scaffolding of your situated embodied existence. And then I ask you to do the same exercise, but with pieces of ecological knowledge. And when I say knowledge, I mean anything that comes from your household of existence, anything from yarrow oil made in midsummer seems the most effective at treating wounds, to I have observed that on the full moon, there are a lot of road accidents and injuries in my hometown. People must slow down on those days and stay close to home, to I love the smell of wet stone right after a fall rainstorm. It often improves sadness, to dandelions grow even in the city in between the concrete cracks, and it is an incredible diuretic and nutritious food. What would a portrait of your slowest, deepest taproot knowledge be? Make a list of 10 observations that are really part of your life. A great exercise is actually to try and articulate the events that lead up to spring, exactly where you live. What are the exact procession of pollen, plants, and leaves and weather events that open into a new season? What are the precise cascade of perfumes day to day? What are the signals that even when it is cold and still as stone alert you to the end of winter? So that's a way of beginning to wake up your ecological sensibility, is to just say like, okay, what are like the 10 events in order that tell my body that spring is coming? That's a kind of ecological knowledge. That's a kind of wisdom. Now, once more, make a list of 20 beings. They can be ancestral, geological, folkloric, fungal, microbial, furred, hoofed, that are crucial to your life where you are planted. Which beings greet you in the morning and then press with their beaks the punctuation mark into the end of a long day. These can also be relational units or entire places. For me, I think of a series of bluestone slabs thrown like stairs down a hillside by ancient glaciers, now gently caressed by a stream. There are locust trees and maples that on each side, lichen lacquers the stone, hibernating like flakes of paint in sun-dried spots. Deer come here to drink. Red-winged blackbirds thread through the barberry bushes, and in early July, you can spot the white flames of ghost pipe curled in the bushes. That is an entire being that I can summon. You can also summon a place and time, a river island in July, a view of farm fields from the vantage point of a hill in January, a flavor of light. One of your beings could be a smell or a sound, the grind and squeal of ice beginning to break up across the lake surface. If we know that myths are durable ways of sending wisdom through catastrophe and cultural collapse, how can we look at our favorite beings, our favorite gleaned seeds of knowledge, and begin to construct a boat, a narrative boat of breath to carry them? What would it mean to create a boat of breath that could potentially carry these through ecological and social collapse? I encourage you to take 5 or so of these beings, and then one piece of wisdom perhaps that you wrote in your list, and try to construct a story that holds them, or a song, or like a series of noises. You know, really, we have no purity here. There are no actual rules. These are all like suggestions that we should mycelial out from. It shouldn't be a literary story though. This is not about like really good language or poeticism or versification. This is about durability. It's about a muscular exhalation. It's about involving the body and your entire organism in such a way that you could transmit that to someone, so that if they move their arm in a certain way, they would remember that the crow flies there at that point. Like, think about using your entire body as a mnemonic device as you encode this myth. You don't, it can be a short story too. Does not have to be long. See how much information you can pack into like 10 lines. And then practice telling the story to other people. And then, and this is the most important part, tell it back to the land from which it was born. Does a wind rise up? A storm? Does a crow bark out in warning? Ask for the land's consent in the story. See if the land enjoys it. We always want to see if other people like it. We'll ask the land, and then expect the information to come in unexpected ways, and trust that your body as an organism will intuit what that is. Use your body as an instrument. Say, tell the story and see if you get consent. We need to learn to ask consent of whole ecosystems with our whole bodies. How can we ask questions with our whole bodies? So what would it mean to give the story back to the land that inspired its creation? So that's the final exercise. And now I think the rest of it, we can go to like 2:30 if anyone wants, and we can talk.
Is it all right if I jump in?
Please, hello.
I'm Coleraine. I'm a tarot artist, and so I'm kind of viewing this through the perspective of like divinatory practice. And I'm also like a visual artist as well. So I think it's really interesting, like kind of going back to what you were saying about pictographic language, and looking at like the tarot as kind of like a pictographic language that's changed and like is interactive with like oral tradition, and then also like its own visual and written tradition. And I think it's interesting, like kind of the origins of tarot and divination practice come from these oral like storytelling practices. And so I think it's funny like how people have tried to convert recently like tarot into this, you know, even if we see like the Rider-Waite Coleman Smith production of tarot, it becomes this like monolith. It's something that like should fit into like a structural box. And so like it's funny like looking at like Alphabet as well as being this like kind of box that we try and put like language and interpretation and our like meaning making of things. So what you were just saying about like the wind responding to like what you say, or like the animals and the vegetation around you responding to what's being said. I was actually like filming a tarot reading the other day, and like some of my cues are not just like bodily cues, they're also like the environment. So I like to read outside as like being a part of like that transmission of like storytelling and like meaning making, because it has to do with the environment. So it's just funny, like I was saying something the other day and like the wind actually like responds when I'm like talking about something. So I don't know, that was just my thought kind of in response to that.
Coleraine, you're like tapping. A lot of people here probably don't know this, and none of my readers know now. I was a professional tarot reader for a long time. And I'm fascinated with tarot, and I did this thing where I planted a tarot card in locations all over the Hudson Valley, buried it so that it was a mnemonic device, so that each card was a real place. And I wrote about it called Rerouting the Tarot. And so that each time I pulled a card, it summoned an actual place for me, and all of the beings in that place who would inform my reading. And I also think I used to do readings that I called holobiont tarot readings, which is it encourages that kind of episodic, epic storytelling, which is it's not linear. It's like a bunch of different cards constellating into meaning. And we should talk about this a lot. It's fascinating. I think tarot is such a complicated terrain because it's been really fused with this kind of anti-Semitic white guy magic that's really, really problematic. And yet it comes from this often folkloric female, or like the old women, the elders, with their pictures, using their whole bodies as psychic organisms. And we have this very visual focus on what psychism is, that you like get a picture and then you're a psychic. But the truth is that your tells, like are coming from your environment. You use your whole body in your environment to receive information.
Yeah, and I was thinking about like Romani culture and how that's like so rooted in the history of tarot, and it's about movement. Like it's not like a fixed place of culture. It's something that like gets translated and moved over time and place. So that's super interesting. I made a deck based on the life of Christ, and that's part of what brought me to this class.
Will you share us pictures?
Yeah, I can share some.
Okay.
I'm working on like publishing it right now, but I think about like the ways that like Romanization actually translates into like Americanization. So it's very interesting, and I could talk about it forever, but I'll save everyone that for now.
Thank you. Fascinating. Yes.
Hi, this is Rachel. I'm jumping in if that's okay.
Great. Please come
Hello.
in.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think about the nervous system of Jesus literally all the time. I think about like Jesus being so regulated in his nervous system, and you know, they're like the overculture tries to trap him in the duality, and he sort of like stops and like does things like writes in the dirt with sticks and spits and stuff, and comes up with that sort of emergent third way that comes from that really grounded, like rooted nervous system. And when Tada was saying about Jesus being Kendrick Lamar, I just like had this image of him like walking on the Sea of Galilee out to the boat of the disciples, and just sort of like, you know, like jamming on the sea, walking, and just completely doing that without showing, not being show offy or anything like that, but just being so connected with the elements and really rooted and grounded in his ecosystem. So I'm just thrilled with being able to have this conversation, because I don't really have places to have it. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think this conversation is going to open up as in the next two modules are really going to be about like the actual cultural context that he was coming out of, because it was a very embodied time. Many healers spit in people's eyes. Many healers, you know, healing someone was a really hands-on experience. It involved touching them, being touched. And in fact, the ways in which Jesus violated a lot of the norms of the time were by touching people you weren't supposed to touch. So, well, this is definitely something that's going to be unfurling between us for a long time. Thank you. Oh, and thank you, Lily, for these. There are so Rider-Waite. Come on, no, there's so many better tarots out there. Yeah. If any, in the Discord chat, if anyone wants to like offer them, please go ahead. I'll offer my favorites. Yeah.
The blog is just one list that a friend shared that has a lot of really great decks in it.
Great.
But I'd be happy to share it. I'm newer to tarot, but I've been making a strong and compulsive effort to bring in as many representative and unique kind of decks that really distort the tradition as possible. Can I ask a really totally different question off base from what we're talking about?
Can you get popped on so I can make eye contact?
I know I'm kind of loud. I'm sorry, I'm kind of loud. I'm on like a balcony.
No, I'm just trying to get you so I can see you. Great. Okay. No, because it's important for me to have that, you know, speaking of like bodies, that be like mirror neuroning. Yeah.
So I'm asking this because I feel like you'd probably have thoughts on it. In terms of the assignment part about that, really thinking about the observations of embodiment in terms of, you know, the changing of seasons. And this is something I spend a lot of time with, but from the perspective of chronic pain, because the changing of seasons for me often is very difficult. I know, you know, day to day how the, you know, pressure changes, you know, wind especially is really bad. And I'm very lucky I have a non-degenerative autoimmune disease, but still something like a beautiful windy day that I want to love and experience can make me feel like bitterly awful and physically like, you know, terrible. And I love to travel also, and like changing environments that like impacts my body so much. And I'm always trying to find a way to get peace with that, because I'm so attuned to wanting to be embody my experience as being, you know, an organism as part of this larger organism. That makes sense.
I am going to offer, so I'm not, Lily, I'm not sure if you know, but I have connective tissue disease and autoimmunity too. So I think of myself as being an instrument for every pressure fluctuation or weather system, and it's a nightmare. So yeah, like I think, and I think in other cultures that people like us were the instruments that other people used as a barometer. That we had information before other people didn't have it. We were like, oh, something's coming. My body's telling me. And I think that we're in this culture, everything is about dualism. So it's good or bad, but it's good and bad. You know, I sometimes think of my body as being, I'm a really good instrument for the earth and reading certain fluctuations. It's terrible experience. I wouldn't wish it on anyone else, but if it's going to happen to me, I'm going to start to actually try and listen to what's coming through. And yeah, I've written this book that is not this book. Well, it is a book. Don't tell anyone. But I wrote a piece called "The Body as a Doorway" about how neurodivergent people with autoimmunity, you know, people with illness are really good instruments for tapping into certain kinds of environmental information that people with normative bodies can't access. And this is a complicated inheritance that we don't have to problematize, we can be really curious about it. So here, I'm gonna pop this in the chat.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, because like you said, that duality is something that you want to get out of, you know, and I do often feel like a blessing of like that, you know, connectivity, that I'm in tune with things that other people, maybe I can pass along to, you know, information. But it can be, I'm sure, like, that's why I asked you, because I know you have history in this, like, it's often just a struggle to get to that point, you know, and figure out how to balance and be like, okay, how do we live, you know, together and make this work?
Yeah, I think right now, one of the things I'm struggling with, and actually I was talking about this with David Abram, who we might record a conversation that I'm going to offer to you guys as a kind of like counterpart to this. He wrote The Spell of the Centrists, and he was one of the big inspirations behind this session, as we were talking about how hard it is to regulate a non-normative body when seasons aren't happening in the same way. And when things are changing so fast and your body is glitchy, you can't even figure it out. And so that's something I want to just name. I don't have any answer for it, but as climate change disrupts seasonal patterns, bodies that are really attuned to that are feeling it, and we're really feeling it right now this summer. Yeah. Someone else has their hand up. Someone want to unmute themselves and come on?
Oh, I got a couple of small trivial things. One is I like the way that tarot decks adapt themselves to previously existing mythologies. I don't know if it's good or bad. I've got 4 tarot decks: William Blake, King Arthur, Alice in Wonderland, and Lord of the Rings. And they all work for me because they're linked to something that I already knew before I heard of tarot. And I hope there isn't some kind of bad malforming happening here, but that's why I like them. I also was thinking of a very kind of trivial piece of cultural erasure that's been going on due to smartphones, but I've been a math tutor for the past 12 years, and all the latest and most recent algebra textbooks assume a student is already familiar with a standard deck of cards, ace through king, hearts, spades, clubs, diamonds, and they're not. I've had half a dozen students that I've taken to their house, a standard deck of cards. They've never seen one before because they're all playing games on their phones instead. And I just find this a weird, because when I was a kid, everybody in my school had a deck of cards. And they don't even know that there's 300 different games that you can play with these things. And I just find it weird how this pillar of the culture I grew up in has been wiped out by the smartphone. And it's, you know, it's a small thing. I mean, there's worse things to lose in a culture than knowing a deck of cards. But you know, I still find it really weird.
I mean, I think about like the, this is where like the Baudrillard simulation and simulacra comes in, like all of those like computer solitaire games. Like, what does it mean when the abstraction of the abstraction is abstracted further? Like, where do you even end up? These are questions that we're gonna live rather than answer. Yeah, there's so many parts of, and also here's an interesting thing. Like, think about a deck of cards and think about complete cultural collapse. And then people come and find cards. They have no idea about any of these games. And then they create a whole culture based on those cards. I mean, that's another thing. It's like what a lot of people are trying to create, like symbols that will this seems so dumb to me, but also interesting. People are trying to create symbols that will let future civilizations know where nuclear waste is stored. And it's just so upsetting in so many different ways. But it also is an interesting question, which is like, what symbols travel? Like, what symbols could make it through complete collapse of our language and our knowledge systems and still transmit something? That's another question. How can we connect tarot to oral storytelling? You can use it as a divinity. I used to use it as a divinatory practice where you would have like, you would pull like 10 cards and then tell a story about the constellation of beings that, or like feelings that arrived around it. There's so many ways you can use any kind of oracle deck to tell stories. One of the things we have to, I'm trying to keep off on everything. Yeah. Yeah, no, Rebecca B. Yeah. Tarot is oral storytelling. Yeah, exactly. It's using your environment and then improvising stories. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that video games actually create a kind of participatory storytelling that other forms don't allow. You get to enter into the story and enact how it happens. I mean, I really think video games are not very good for a lot of different reasons, but I also think that they're interesting. Does anyone else? Okay, we have Jael. I don't know how to pronounce your name. How about you? Come on, you've been waiting for a long time.
Hello. That is exactly correct. So thank you for that. Wow. Okay, lots to say. But let's see. I wanted to speak on because don't even get me started on tarot. Don't even know how many decks. But, I also read and study constellational astrology and things. But one of the first things that was coming up for me in this conversation was the way that the queer community up in like just during my lifetime experienced a shift from still having oral tradition and like when I was a teenager coming out, like older butches taught me how to like tuck my shirt in and there's the style was like we wear belts and like this is how you take your belt off and wrap it around your hand when you're like getting ready to protect yourself in a knife fight and like you know and just like I mean those are just like a couple examples, but there's like all of this like culture and tradition and things that was only accessible through gaining access to like queer bars and like queer community spaces and like the things that we had together because it's not okay to be queer, so it's suppressed. And also like my generation was alive during the AIDS crisis but not old enough to have been directly involved in the early part of it. So like we lost our like a huge number of our elders, just like this devastating loss of elders. And then now I'm in this place where I'm like, especially as a trans person, I like am really already an elder just because I adjusted for length of average life. I mean, not to be dark, but that is a thing. And I, for a long time, have been trying to understand what this huge disconnect is for me, and I think a lot of people my age and older and younger generations, because I haven't found that the younger generation came into the queer community or looks to us the same way as I did to my elders. And listening to that, it was like this missing piece of the puzzle that finally just clicked for me, because the younger generation entered their queerness through internet culture. And
Through
I
capitalism.
Yeah, well,
Capitalism co-opting queer culture and taking it. I mean, me and my friends were just talking about how in queer culture, you used to be able to know where to go by certain kinds of like just tells and
Yes.
stories. And now they've been co-opted by capitalism. So you go somewhere where the tells are, but it's actually unsafe. So you have no way of reading the culture for safety anymore as a queer person.
Yes.
Because capitalism just took everything. Yeah, no.
Oh my gosh.
Everything you're saying. And the AIDS epidemic was like, I oftentimes think that the best way we can memorialize the AIDS epidemic is with stories, because they died because these stories were too dangerous to write down, and then the people who had them died. Yeah.
Yes.
We have never metabolized the AIDS epidemic. That's a whole other tangent, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And yes, thank you for saying all of that. Like, and that's just it's always why I also like I never went to college, and I've always been a writer and a thinker in these things, and lots of people have always, like, even to this day, people are like, you should write a book, you should do this, you should that. But every time I've tried to pursue more like traditionally academic or traditionally like I am writing a thing down and making a permanent thing, I lose the thread. Like, I don't really want to. And what I've always gravitated towards as an artist, and even in healing work that I've done, is direct. Like, I don't want to canonize something. I want like video performances of drag that I did in the past is a ghost of what happened. Like, it doesn't translate. That performance was for that exact moment, for that exact audience, for that time. That community had I was in a dialogue with that community during that time that meant that this little look that I gave meant something to them that doesn't mean anything anymore or couldn't be legible. And like all of those things is like, it's just, I don't know. I also just like feel validated also for myself on so many levels about the ways that I haven't felt like the art and the healing arts and the pursuing the things that I've pursued and been interested in that come naturally to me, like storytelling, like being right now in this moment and having a direct interaction that only lives in this moment, has made me feel and been told to be not legitimate or not something substantive because it can't be put in a textbook. And I'm just like, no, like that just really, I don't know, it really solidifies or validates that for me. And the last little thing I wanted to say too is this idea that I sometimes do talk about with younger queer people about identity labels and the ways that identity labels have, they're this, you know, we've all seen it. It's this thing that's just like proliferating. It's like, it is this abstraction of abstraction kind of thing. And one of the things that I think is kind of, at least in my opinion, an important piece of context is that the reason identity labels are even useful or important is because we are being identified to be targeted.
It's a counter reaction, yeah.
For us, the only usefulness of it is not for us to put it on and be like, this is my static self that will never change. These are the identity labels that make who I am. Like, here's the list on my profile. But rather, like, it does have utility because we are under attack. Like, it's important to for example, to identify the differences between like what trans people are experiencing versus non-trans queer people in the community for whatever, for resource allocation. But if we weren't under attack, if we weren't being targeted, if we did, like, we wouldn't want or need those labels, because who you are is a complex, fluid thing that needs to constantly be able to evolve and change, you know? So like, it gets dangerous to attach oneself to those things. But anyways, those were just a few of my many thoughts. So thank you so much for this work. It is.
I just want to, there's so many things I want to say. First is, you know, in the first session, we talked about species lunation. For me and my gender, I think about gender lunation, which is that every single day, it's a little bit different.
Yes.
And that we hold people accountable to like the identities they've chosen. No, everything is evolving. You're feeling through these things every day. Just like the moon is a different phase every day, so is your gender a different phase every day. But I also think there's this other sense that I've been feeling lately. I write books, but I have a sense that they don't last. And that the things that last are, you know, Oceana said, she stopped recording her grief rituals. Like the things that last are the things that don't show up on camera. You know how breath is ephemeral, and that tells us that everything is ephemeral. It's these gatherings we have with our elders where we say, like, tell me the story. Like, if we get anything from this course, it's to create ephemeral gatherings that can't be photographed and that include more than human kin and our elders, and include us sharing things that then pass away. They're there like a comet streak. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for everything you shared. Does anyone else have their hand up? Hannah,
Hello.
let's bring you on.
So coming in from sort of the stack of pancakes that is the Venn diagram of tarot and queerness and gender and sexual identification and all of these and marginalized spiritualities and all of these different places. And one of the things that I've been really looking at lately is, and disability with connective tissue disorder and autoimmune problems. Hey, stack of pancakes. Where we're looking at, we seldom look at the things that are going right. We're looking at the things that are going wrong. And when I was going through the class material and looking at it and talking about mycelium and where it's the connective tissue of an environment and where we notice it when it breaks down, and looking at those pieces that stitch through all of these different layers of our existences, where we are ecosystems, where we are within an ecosystem, and learning to use all of the resources at our disposal, whether it be books or videos or video games or oral histories, the leather archives out of Chicago, where they're recording materials culture for people whose families aren't carrying that, where we're looking at creating larger family systems and larger kin networks between humans and the other than human, and the beings that we are in relationship with and constantly in flux and change, and really using all of the resources at our disposal so that we have the most diverse possibility of transmitting information through. My life repeatedly has been saved by, and not by any exaggeration, by how somebody used different modes of transmission to get a piece of information that was part of how my life came through. Whether it was the musical Fun Home and the Ring of Keys song that talks about identifying butch lesbians by the ring of keys at their hip and having that moment of social recognition, or a microbiologist who looked at me and went, oh, this is the system that's malfunctioning in your guts that's trying to kill you. And so all of these pieces can weave together, and it's not just one modality that's going to get us through all of this. And that's something I'm really appreciating by how you're looking at it and how everybody in this class seems to be looking at it, where we're talking about transmission through voice and through dance and through writing and through sculpture, and looking at the ecosystem of information. So thank you, everybody, for being a part of that.
Yes, Hannah, I really stand by Anna Singh's contaminated salvage culture. We go in, we don't try and take the microplastics out. We use everything available to us. I was saved by fan fiction forums online as a 12-year-old survivor who was queer and trying to make sense of myself. I mean, like, God damn it, we're going to use everything we can to create community and to create new stories. And it's going to be like those oyster mushrooms going towards radioactive material. Like, we'll grow towards radioactive technology and then hijack it. Like, I also think that this course is not about going back to some enshrined pastoral Eden where we were all oral storytelling and had no vaccines, and, you know, most children died before the age of 3. Like, we're not fetishizing the past. We're salvaging and composting the present with everything available. Yeah. Thank you for really putting a finger on that, Hannah. So I think we're coming to the end of our time, because I know that we have a lot of people like me who are disabled and like screen screens are intense. So I think we have like 10 minutes, and I want to open up the space for more questions, more responses.
Hello. Hi, I'm Karetha, joining you all from Kenya in East Africa. Hi, my heart is so full. I don't even know, my body is just like reverberating. When I was in undergrad a few years ago, we were in a philosophy class, and I kept feeling like I had to keep defending my ancestors, because the whole university education was all the silly Africans who never recorded anything, and that's why they lost everything. And it was always for me like an unanswerable. I didn't have a response. You say, because the thing that would always be asked is, if indigenous people knew all these things, if there was all this wisdom, if truly your lives were of value or whatever, then what happened? Like, where is it all? And of course, I was living in an urban area, like hundreds of kilometers away from where my ancestors are, like colonization, all of that. It was completely decontextualized, and I was like 19 or 20, and kind of just really heartbroken. And I remember writing a note to my ancestors on the side of my paper, writing a note, and I was just like, why would you leave us like this? Why would you leave us adrift? And you knew, I knew that they knew what was coming. So how could you leave us with nothing for the future? And oh my God, to be here now, I mean, so many years later, having learned in so many, asking better questions with every day, and with my body, my entire body, and in community, it's so humbling to come to a place, to be at my ancestors' kind of feet, and to be like, oh my God, oh my God, you didn't leave us, like we were not alone, like I wasn't as defenseless as I thought. To hear you say that, there are these indigenous stories that have lasted hundreds of years, that have more information than what this scientific method is teaching. I kind of like just lay down on my bed. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I just said sorry. I said, thank you, ancestors. I am so sorry. I understand. Like, I couldn't understand why they wouldn't just record it. Like, it was like, it's the symbols. Like, I was like, it's a symbol, like, come on. And yeah, I'm just so humbled. And of course, I am so honored to be in space, because I mean, there's this entire thing of like feeling like you don't have a history, so to speak, and yet you have it, and it's in your body. And also, like, as a queer person in Africa, and now we're dealing with the other part of queer people didn't exist in the continent. This is a new white invention. So it's like we're straddling this, it's a maelstrom. It's like the attacks are coming from, I feel like we feel like we have to defend ourselves from so many people, sometimes even your own continent folk, your fellow Africans. And my friends and I, you wonder, do you have to find like artifacts showing woman to woman marriages or what 500 years ago in some kingdom? And you don't really need to do that, because I mean, we exist as we are, and that's enough. And my ancestors have been speaking and telling me, like, don't worry so much about the books and the proving that queer and trans people belong here. Don't worry so much about proving anything to anyone, and just like, create the languages for yourself to speak to each other, and know how to speak intimately with your loved ones in every village where you belong. And like with your exercise of like 50 words, if every word is up here, just the 50 words. And I'm wondering, like, for me, it's very clearly the words I would need in the villages that I love, in the towns that I love, the words that I would need to speak to the people that I love. And that's such a, yeah, I'm just so moved, y'all. I'm just like, I don't even know. Like, I'm so moved. Thank you so much.
You're moving me so much. I also just think the most important point is the feeling that we have to go back and prove this. Use the colonial mechanism of proof to prove that we're worth being alive, that our ancestors existed. it's such a violence. It's a violence layered on a violence. I read a lot. There's a great book called Against Purity by Alexis Shotwell, talking about how the very mechanisms of reparation for the ancestors of the people killed in the boarding schools in Canada force the ancestors to enter into the same violent classification system that it's supposed to be repairing. It's just so interesting that a lot of the times, like, reparation and proof just re-articulates the same violence it's supposed to be remediating. Oh, thank you. I think we should leave it there. Do you want to say anything else, Karwitha? Is that how you pronounce it? Karwitha?
Yes, you pronounce, well, it's, the I is pronounced like an E. So
Okay.
it's like in pen, so it would be Karwitha. But that's all right too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just to say thank you to all of you, and blessings.
Blessings to everyone. I think we're gonna leave it there because that feels pretty big. Everyone, thank you. This has been more medicinal than you know. Thank you. Okay, everyone be safe, be well. Go and smell something really good this week. Lots of love.